Hi, welcome to the first ever Higgy Pop's Ghost Stories for Christmas, with some specially selected ghost stories just for Christmas. And we're going to head off to Oxford in England first for a story from Bill Spectre.
In 1610, a gentleman named George Napper, who was educated at Corpus Christi College in Oxford, was hanged, drawn and quartered. His crime was being a Catholic priest. He might well have got away with it and been released by the court had he not taken the trouble whilst in Oxford jail to convert a Protestant prisoner to Catholicism, and on top of that he refused to swear to be true to the Protestant faith. Well, as I say, he was hanged, drawn and quartered. His head was impaled onto either the top of Tom Tower or onto the steeple of the cathedral at Christchurch, no one knows quite which, but either way, his four quarters were then placed onto the gates leading into the city. His spirit is then said to have gathered up his four quarters, and now, in the dead of night, listen very quietly, and you may well hear the ghost of George Napper as he gallops for all eternity on his ghostly steed through the streets of Oxford in a never-ending quest for his head.
Thanks very much to Bill for that story. Bill Spectre does ghost walks in Oxford, and I highly recommend them. I went on one earlier this year and it's a really good spooky night out. Right, let's move on to our next story. This one will be read by a guy called Jem Roberts, who's currently writing a book named Tales of Britain about mythical creatures and British legends, so obviously quite relevant to my YouTube channel and my website. So I asked if he'd share one of the stories from the book with us for this special Ghost Stories video, and the one he's going to tell us is Sigurd's Howe.
Warm greetings of the cold season to you all. This is Brother Bernard, reading to you from Tales of Britain, a brand new collection of 77 folk tales taken from all around the British Isles, from Land's End to John O'Groats, with tourist guides to each tale's location. Now, of the 77 tales, there aren't that many of what we would typically call ghost stories. But this story I'm going to read to you now, Sigurd's Howe, a horrifying tale of the northeast coast of Scotland from many, many centuries ago, does read somewhat like a prequel to an M.R. James tale, some story of a lost Viking artifact which heaps curses upon the head of its discoverer. But a warning should be warned about the tale of Sigurd's Howe. This is probably not a great story for anyone who isn't a big fan of severed heads. For those who are big fans of severed heads, perhaps you should seek professional help of some kind. Sigurd Eysteinsson, the Norwegian lord who decided to call himself Sigurd the Mighty, was a huge fan of severed heads, because Sigurd the Mighty was a Viking. The Vikings all had bloodthirsty names: Olaf the Merciless, Bjorn the Family Smasher, and Conan the Serious Problem. But Sigurd the Mighty was one of the nastiest Vikings of all. Sigurd lived up in frozen Norway, but while he and his brother Rognvald were sailing around in their longship one day, they saw the green and pleasant isles of the Orkneys up in northern Scotland, and liked the look of them so much, they and their band of equally violent and unpleasant Norse warriors stormed right over there, kicked the king of the Orkneys out, which is to say, sliced him into pieces, and declared the Orkneys their own private kingdom. This was the Viking way. In fact, they would soon decide to grab whole chunks of England in much the same spirit. As Rognvald set off to find other countries to call his own, Sigurd remained behind to rule over the Orkneys. However, as a Viking, he soon got bored of all the paperwork and decided to go and grab more bits of Scotland to add to his collection. He began snaking his way down the eastern shore, killing everyone who stood in his path, until, one day, he came upon the castle of Maelbrigt, otherwise known as Maelbrigt the Buck-Toothed. You wouldn't have money on poor Maelbrigt to be the man to vanquish the mighty Sigurd. He was as skinny as a rake, no more than 5 feet tall, rather spotty, and, as his name suggested, He had big, goofy teeth jutting from his overbite. When he saw Sigurd advancing on his castle, it was all he could do to stammer out, Who goes there? It is Sigurd the Mighty, and your castle is pretty much mine already, roared the Viking to hooting laughter from all his soldiers. My castle is secure, squeaked Maelbrigt. We shall defend it with all our might. As I said, Sigurd replied, all your might won't be enough, so I'm already trying to decide what colour to paint those ramparts. Maelbrigt's soldiers did not like being laughed at, and they nudged their lord. Go on, sir. We're as good as that lot. We can beat them. Tell him. We won't give up that easy, Sigurd, cried Maelbrigt with growing confidence. Any man of this land is equally able as any of you Norse nuisances. We shall do battle. Indeed we will, Goofy, Sigurd replied to bigger laughs. 40 of my men will face 40 of your men in the field of combat, and the winner gets the castle. 40 men? Only 40, yes. Maelbrigt did a quick head count. He had a total of 38 men, but there was nothing else for it. He gave a little scream, asked his old granny and cousin Elspeth to put on some armour, and replied to Sigurd, Very well, let the battle commence at dawn. Any time is good with me, Sigurd laughed, but we'll see you in the morning, toothy boy. The next morning, Maelbrigt and his 40 men waited, shields before them and swords drawn and sharpened. Out of the morning mist stepped Sigurd, and 40 other figures stood behind him. I do love a bit of a morning scrap, ha 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 ha, Sigurd laughed. Those are your 40 men? They certainly are, the finest fighters of the north, Maelbrigt bravely replied, each able to take on anything you throw at us. They look as if they couldn't even plunder a carrot from a bunny rabbit, hooted Sigurd with a snarl. In fact, they look like such weaklings we probably didn't even need to, cheat. And with that, each of the 40 figures behind Sigurd suddenly doubled to 80. Half of them had been hiding behind another soldier's back. Maelbrigt barely had a second to react to this treachery before Sigurd's cry went up. Vikings! Bloody slaughter before breakfast! Ha 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 ha! And the fight began. It was not a pleasant sight. You certainly wouldn't have wanted to try and put a tent up in that field, not during the torrents of unspeakable violence which immediately burst forth, or afterwards where barely a blade of grass was visible among the butchered remains of Maelbrigt's men. Maelbrigt himself fell victim to Sigurd's own sword within the first 42 seconds of the battle, and, true to form, Sigurd hacked off the poor buck-toothed loser's head for his collection before trotting off to claim the now empty castle for himself. He put Maelbrigt's head on his saddle, where all Vikings like to show off the heads of soldiers they had killed, and he set off for home. It was rather a long return journey to Orkney, though, and before too long, Maelbrigt's big buck teeth began to rub against Sigurd's rump. Sigurd was tough, of course. He barely noticed when the head's teeth broke his skin. He just thought he'd put some cream on it later when he got home. But as they camped that night, the wound in Sigurd's leg seemed worse than he had first thought. Maelbrigt's teeth had sheared right through the skin as the head jangled around on Sigurd's saddle, and the whole of Sigurd's bum was already looking blackened and smelling very nasty indeed. In the morning, the mighty Viking tried to walk, but failed. All of his soldiers backed away at the horrible stench which was now coming from Sigurd's leg. And, to cut a horrible story short, the greedy, cruel Viking never saw another dawn. Sigurd was buried where he died, near a small Scottish town now known as Dornoch, and his burial mound was called Sigurd's Howe. Maelbrigt had beaten the big bully Sigurd the Mighty after all. Admittedly, a bit late for him to celebrate it in any way, but as Sigurd's servants collected together his collection of severed heads after his funeral, they swore that one of those heads had the biggest, big, buck-toothed grin. The end.
Right, next up is a story of my own. I live in quite a haunted town, so I thought I'd share the story of a local legend right here in the southwest of England. This is a story about the Crooked Fiddler. I live in a large housing estate in the southwest of England. The town is fairly new. In fact, I remember going on family walks through the countryside as a kid here, when there was nothing but farmland as far as the eye could see. There were only a handful of farmers on the land and a few patches of woodland. Today, not much of the woods remain, but their grim history and the legend of the Crooked Fiddler lives on. The legend tells of the story of an evil old man, sometimes described as a shadowy figure. Some believe he lived in the woodlands at the turn of the century. It was said that he would lure children into the woods with the music from his fiddle. Children from the local farms who were unlucky enough to be ensnared by his ditty were never seen again. No one knew the true identity of the man, who was often heard but rarely seen. But he was given a nickname, the Crooked Fiddler, and over time the woods became known as Fiddler's Wood, a name which is still used by local residents to this day. When crews were working on the construction of a new road in the mid-60s, it said that work was frequently halted due to the sound of children. Worried that kids were playing on the construction site, the men downed their tools and conducted a search, but no children were ever found. After the new road came the new town. The farms were forced to sell up and work started on thousands of new homes. But there was an obstacle. The family who lived in Webb's farm refused to sell. However, they were eventually driven out of their home by strange goings-on. I remember seeing the farmer on a local news programme saying how he and his family were often bothered by the faint musical sound coming from outside the house. His 3 daughters, all of which were in their teens by the time they moved out, often reported hearing children crying while they were alone in rooms. And most terrifying, the youngest daughter once claimed to have seen the Crooked Fiddler's face peering through a window one evening. Despite a thorough search of the farm, no trespassers were found. Nowadays, the area has changed beyond all recognition, but even to this day, residents report similar activity. Most commonly, people say they've heard eerie, disembodied music on quiet nights, usually in the summer months when sleeping with their bedroom windows open. Dog walkers often report hearing the sound of creepy fiddle music echoing through parts of the ancient woods, which still exist in the town. And many people still refuse to go into the woods alone, especially at night. Thanks very much for sharing that story with us, Jem. That's one that features in Jem Roberts' new book, Tales of Britain. And if you want to get hold of that book, you can support the campaign now and pre-order it. There's details in the description.
A few months after the birth of our first child, Olivia, we moved into a new house on the outskirts of town. It had a fantastic view from the kitchen window of fields as far as the eye could see, beyond a small stone outbuilding which stood in ruins at the end of our garden. Before long, Olivia was sat with us at the kitchen table. Her high chair allowed her to see out of the window. To our surprise, she started giggling and waving out of the window. Her attention was fixed on the outbuilding, with its broken window and the rotting eaves of a long since collapsed roof. This went on for a long time on almost a daily basis, and we couldn't work out what was catching Olivia's attention as the outbuilding was completely empty. When she started talking, we were finally able to ask her who she was waving at. "The little boy," she answered. We were a bit taken aback by this, and my husband asked, "Is he nice?" Olivia thought for a moment, glanced in the direction of the shed, and then said, "Yes." We came to the conclusion that our daughter had an imaginary friend, but we didn't want to fuel it any further, so we never brought it up again. And to our relief, she eventually grew out of it. But that wasn't the last we heard of the little boy. Just before Olivia's 4th birthday, we welcomed her little brother Jacob into the world. And it wasn't long before he too was waving at the ruined outbuilding, again long before he could form proper sentences. We were forced to wait at least another year before we could ask why he was waving. "The little boy," he said. It was pretty chilling hearing our son give the exact same reason for his interest in the shed that his older sister had given us 2 whole years before he was born, and had not mentioned since. We didn't even know if Olivia still remembered her imaginary friend. Once again, my husband asked the question, "Is the little boy nice?" Jacob ducked a little, as if hiding below the frame of the window, and said, "Yes, but I think he's lying."
Okay, let's move on to our final story now, and this one comes from Fraser Lee, who's a bit of an expert in horror fiction. He's written for my website higgypop.com before, and I wanted to give him a chance to share a spooky story with you just for Christmas.
Tom's breath fogged up his window, then disappeared like a ghost. He tried again, but no luck. The frost clinging to the outside of the window pane refused to melt. He wished his parents would just go to bed. He'd been kneeling here on his bed, leaning on the windowsill for what seemed like an eternity. Then footsteps on the stairs. Action stations. It was Mum, here to tuck Tom into bed. He lay rigidly still, breathing heavily with his arms by his side. He felt his mother's shadow falling over him as she leaned in to kiss him softly on the head. Then she grabbed him and tickled him. He let out a loud giggle. How on earth did she do that every time? Anyone else would have fallen for it and believed he was asleep, but not Mum with her amazing radar skills. They shared a laugh about it, and she kissed him again and turned off the light. He listened intently as Mum closed the door and went back downstairs to the living room. Must be wrapping my presents right now, he thought, his ears conjuring sounds of foil paper and sticky tape. This was the most crucial part of Christmas Eve for Tom, waiting for Mum, Dad and Big Sis to come to bed. Then he had to leave it for just long enough to make sure they were asleep, without nodding off himself and missing his chance. Still listening intently, he remembered how he'd bungled the job 2 years ago when he was just 8. He was older now and wiser, an expert in nocturnal manoeuvres. One day he'd be a secret agent. Tom awoke with a jolt and shivered. His bedclothes had made a bid for freedom, leaving just his pyjamas to protect him. He grabbed his alarm clock, the luminous face teasing him with the time. 4 o'clock a.m. Oh, flipping brilliant. He'd nodded off and been asleep for hours. But there was still time. He'd better move fast and silent, like that amazing ninja he'd seen on the telly. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, and ever so carefully stood up. Without a sound, he crept over to the door. Careful now, this was where it could all go horribly wrong. One false move, and he'd wake the whole household. He reached out for the door handle, his arm rehearsing the exact distance he could open the door before it creaked. Slowly, slowly, he pulled the door open, slipped sideways through the gap, grabbed the outside handle, and closed the door behind him with the tiniest click. Heart beating, Tom stood on the dark landing for a few seconds, catching his breath. That was intense, his best ninja move ever. Satisfied he hadn't woken his folks, he padded gently across the landing towards the stairs. The soft, soundless carpet beneath his feet, he allowed his mind to wander a little. He began thinking of the prize that now awaited him at the end of his mission, remembering how wonderful his presents had looked under the tree last year. His pace quickened as he reached the foot of the stairs. An animal hiss erupted in his ears as he stepped into the hallway. Tom searched the gloom for the source of the din, dropping to his knees to peer under the sideboard. Wild eyes suddenly glared at him from the shadows there, along with more violent hissing. It was Fudge, the family cat. Whispering as loud as he dared, Tom told Fudge to be quiet. The animal shrank back beneath the sideboard with a final exasperated meow. The cat had almost been his undoing, but failure was not an option. He had to go and squeeze and prod at the parcels bearing his name. Downstairs was even chillier than his bedroom, cold seeping into the hallway through hidden nooks and crannies. Tom pulled his dressing gown tighter and snuck into the living room. It was pitch black inside, owing to Mum's annoying habit of switching everything off and unplugging it every night to be on the safe side. This often drove Dad to distraction, especially if he'd set the telly box to record late-night sports shows. An acrid metallic smell filled the room. What had they been wrapping in here? Only one way to find out, thought Tom, as he edged his way around the perimeter of the room, feeling along the cabinet, then the wall. Finally, he felt the Christmas tree as he brushed against it. Baubles clinked icily as he located the power cord and followed it, crawling across the floor to the power socket in the corner. He felt the cold metal pins in his hand, and turning the plug right side up, inserted it into the wall. Something wet dripped on his hand just as he pressed the switch. Something heavy and slick slid across his head. Tom scrabbled backwards in shock. Looking up, he saw the fairy lights twinkling. They were red, not clear, as they had been earlier today, and all last week since they'd decorated the tree. He stared, mouth agape, as he realised the lights weren't red after all. Rather, it was what hung around them that gave them their crimson glow. The Christmas tree was slicked with blood, and covered in strands of flesh and hair. Mum's hair, and his sister's. He could pick out his dad's tattoo on a piece of bloodied skin that dangled above a bauble like a handkerchief. Drooping branches struggled beneath the weight of the innards scattered around them like red tinsel. Ruined organs steamed like butcher's offal at the hot kiss of the lights. Eyeballs hung there like baubles. He could recognise some of the pieces. He'd seen them in the big pop-up anatomy book at school. A section of intestine here, a tangle of veins there. Tom scrambled to his feet. Nausea hit him, and he vomited stomach bile onto the living room rug. Turning fearfully around, he saw his family lying lifeless on the sofa like grotesque dolls. Their bodies had been torn apart, flesh ravaged, and rib cages exposed like the hulls of broken ships. The room span. Tom sank to his knees, a dry scream dying in his throat. Then he saw them. Cold eyes watching him from the dark black of the fireplace, watching him touch his presence.
Thanks for watching this one-off special video, and it's all about sharing ghost stories for Christmas, an old Victorian tradition of telling ghost stories at Christmas in Britain, and I just wanted to revive that tradition. If you want to find out more about that tradition, go to higgypop.com/stories. You'll find more details there. But thanks for watching this one. Let me know what you thought in the comments below. I hope it wasn't too scary, but don't worry, Santa's on his way. It'll be magical again soon. Have a good Christmas. Bye bye.